Mr. President, the House has passed Senate Bill number 5280 with the following amendments. 5280.
Last line.
Bernardine, Chief Clerk.
Senator Frame.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the Senate do concur in the House amendments to Senate Bill 5280.
Senator Frame moves that the Senate do concur in the House amendments to Senate Bill 5280. Remarks, Senator Frame.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm going to restate a phrase, a paragraph I said when we first passed this bill out of this chamber. And that is, Mr. President, that children need trusted adults in their life. And particularly when something that is very, very wrong is happening to them, they need to know that the adults in their life will do something when they know that child's being abused. And those adults can and must help make that harm stop. The legislation before you helps ensure that children can count on faith leaders to help protect them by adding clergy and religious leaders to the list of mandated reporters of child abuse and neglect here in Washington State. Mr. President, the House made two changes to this legislation, one very minor, adding the word elder to the definition of clergy, and one very significant. Namely, the legislation before us today requires that members of the clergy report suspected abuse or neglect of a child, no matter the scenario in which they obtain that information. Mr. President, I want to be very clear about what we are and are not talking about today. The legislation states that when members of the clergy know a child is being abused or neglected, including if that child is being sexually abused, they have a duty to stop it. And they have a duty to stop it by reporting it to law enforcement or the Department of Children, Youth, and Families so those agencies can take action to stop or interrupt the harm to that child. The member of the clergy is not, I repeat, not compelled to testify in front of a court of law to that fact. That is where the clergy penitent privilege comes into play, Mr. President, and it is untouched by this bill. Rather, law enforcement or the Department of Children, Youth, and Families will have to do additional work to further substantiate that claim, but in the meantime, Mr. President, they can ensure that that child is safe. Mr. President, taking this action today will not make us the first state in the nation to do this. Not the first state, not the first territory, but rather the 8th. 6 other states and 1 territory already require mandated reporting of abuse or neglect of a child, even during confession or the comparable context in other faith communities. Those states include New Hampshire, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Texas, West Virginia, and Guam. Mr. President, I urge the body to concur with the House amendments and help our state take this significant step forward to protect children from further abuse and neglect. I ask for your concurrence. Thank you.
Further remarks, Senator Warnick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in opposition to the motion to concur. I am a member of a church that is going to be affected by this bill. I voted for the bill as it left the Senate because it did not have the provision in there about confession or the sacrament of reconciliation. As I said when the original bill went through, I abhor child abuse. I am absolutely opposed to that. What happens with this bill, if it were to go through today, and I believe it probably will, the Catholic Church and other churches already consider clergy as mandatory reporters, except for the act of reconciliation or confession, as was earlier stated. This has been tradition for centuries and centuries and centuries. The act of confession, for those that you may not know, can be done anonymously. It can be done in a confessional booth where the clergy, the priest, does not see who is talking to them. The act of confession asks for reconciliation, asks for forgiveness, but the priest may not know who has confessed that to them. So we're putting them in almost an untenable position. The other piece that I'm wondering about, I have a good friend who is actually a priest and a canon lawyer. So he's a lawyer within the Catholic Church. That brings up the question to me. We have a number of lawyers in this body that understand the attorney-client privilege. Where would that be different than what we are trying to push through today? How would the attorney-client privilege be different than what we're asking our priests to divulge today? Again, I don't want to see any children abused. I don't want to see anybody look the other way. But during the act of confession, the sacrament of confession, it will be impossible for our clergy to comply with this law. I ask you to put this bill down, or ask for a do not concurrence, and ask for a meeting to discuss this further, but absolutely opposed to this motion.
Further remarks? Senator Patton.
Thank you, Mr. President. Also speaking against the motion, and I also supported this bill. I think we all did. I think it passed unanimously when it left the Senate in good shape. And it had the priest penitent privilege in there, which is a long-standing privilege recognized in law. And of course, the purpose of it is for individuals to become reconciled. It's also called, besides confession, reconciliation, to become reconciled. And we talk so much on this floor, and criminal justice, other issues about redemption, about people mending their ways and doing better, and we want to encourage that. And that's what this sacrament does. But part of the key part of it is the seal of the confessional, which is broken. They took the priest penitent privilege out in the House. And I mean, I agreed with Senator Frame when she had the bill here on final passage in the Senate. So I just ask you and plead with you, this is not going to work if it passes, as indicated by the gentlelady from the 13th District. A lot of the confessions, the traditional confessions, are anonymous. There's a screen between the priest and the penitent. And, you know, if it was face-to-face, would somebody confess that under these circumstances? They probably wouldn't go to confession, wouldn't receive, presumably, the graces. And there is so much other good done in this priest penitent privilege in a number of different religions. So I really ask you to think deep and consider going with the Senate bill, which was far preferable, and voting down this motion to concur with the House amendments. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further remarks? Senator Saldana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak on that we do concur. And as someone that was raised in with a deep faith tradition, raised in my Catholic community, the importance of reconciliation has always been something that is about reconciliation with our God. And the role of an ordained clergy person is there to play a role in helping us get to that reconciliation. But reconciliation recognizes that a child that speaks up is not the person that is doing the wrong. And if an adult, whether they are serving as that role of the intermediary, to be able to speak up and say a child is being hurt, does not require that mandatory person to know who is doing the hurting. doesn't require them to take further action, but does require them to let those that can take action, take action. And I don't believe that, I do believe that we can concur and recognize that it doesn't compel them to do anything less than acknowledging that a child is being hurt. It does not betray, I believe, what is that sacrament. And I believe that we, as people that are here to represent the people of Washington, can require that the people can believe in their faith, practice their religion, but also participate in making sure that children are being protected.
Further remarks, Senator Fortunato.
Thank you, Mr. President. This particular bill has eaten at me all weekend. Every single priest I talk to is willing to go to jail over this issue. This body, you happen to, if you recall, I am very much pro-Second Amendment. We've infringed on the Second Amendment. This is an infringement on the First Amendment. 2,000 years, this has been a sacrament in our church. This is not about protecting children. This is an infringement on our Catholic tradition and our religious traditions. This is an infringement on the sacrament of reconciliation, which, by the way, Mr. President, if I could say the last few words that a priest tells you in confession, go and sin no more. You do not get reconciliation. You do not get absolution if you say, I'm going to continue doing whatever it is you confess. You get absolution when you promise not to do it anymore. You get you must, this is very, very personal, but you go into confession. The reason you go there is you feel guilty. You want your soul cleansed. You want to make yourself right with God. And you don't do that by continuing to do the very thing that you went into the confessional for. You are taking away the right of that person to go to a priest and have that. What's that priest going to say? Is he going to say, continue doing what you've been doing? If you in a confession anonymously confess that you've been doing something to harm children, is he going to tell you, go ahead and do that? No. He's going to tell you, you must turn yourself in. You must stop doing this. You must make yourself right with the law in order to get absolution. So this is nonsense. This is an infringement on our Catholic tradition that has stood for 2,000 years, Mr. President. This is well, I voted for this. I voted to send this to the House, and now it comes back as a total infringement on our Catholic faith. This is a do not concur. So this is a no on concurrence, Mr. President. Thank you.
Further remarks, Senator Cooter.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of the motion. And I can only speak as a Catholic. That's the religion I was raised in. And I don't feel that it's an infringement of the sacrament of confession. And I don't, Mr. President, because we're talking about a crime against children. And we're talking about the fact that, yes, a priest may say, go and sin no more, but the reality is that isn't what happens. And that child is in danger. And that's why we need to have mandatory reporting. because we need to stop the danger to that child. The lifelong impacts are enormous. And I know this from stories in my own, from my home state, from this state, from people I've known who've had abuse happen to them in the church. When you're talking about a trusted adult and you go to them and they're the ones that end up abusing you, there's no sacrament there. There's no holiness there. There's no need to protect that, Mr. President. This is the kind of situation that deserves us to look beyond the superficial, this is about religion, religion, religion. It's not about religion. It's about a crime. It's about a crime against children. And we need to understand that that is such a serious thing, that we are going to do a very serious thing and join 7 other states that require reporting and do not exempt confession. I respect everyone's right to believe whatever they want to believe. But the bottom line here is little people don't always get that choice, Mr. President. And with the lifelong impacts that child abuse has, that we know happens and that they grow up and have to live with and deal with the rest of their life, it's incumbent upon us to stop it as often as we can and as soon as we can. And that's why I urge the body to support this motion. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further remarks, Senator Patton?
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in response to the last speaker, this isn't going to happen. The priests, if a sin is confessed to them in confession, they have an obligation as a priest not to divulge that to anybody. They take their orders when they are ordained a priest, and this is part of it. So it's not going to work. They have, and I've talked to a number too, they are willing to go to jail in order on this. Now, as far as the abuse, I when I was in the Senate, helped extend the statute of limitations. I've talked to the good new representative from the 46th district, and we worked with her on her legislation. It finally got worked out, and we worked together to deal with that. And the bill, this was not in the bill as it left the Senate. We did not have hearings on this in the Senate. But the bottom line is, it's not going to work. It's going to cause more disruption and concern and harm by passing it. So again, I just ask you to dig deep and see what this is going to do. It's going to be counterproductive. So urging again a no vote on the motion to concur.
Further remarks, Senator Fortunato?
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. President. We passed this bill, I think almost unanimously, out of this chamber, sent it to the other house. We did that because every one of us here agree there is no more heinous crime than abuse of a child, an innocent child. That's why we passed this bill, to protect those children. Now, we are willing to jeopardize a unanimous vote here in the Senate. I don't know anybody that would vote against this bill if it didn't have this provision in it. And now, we've taken that, and we've taken that away from those of us that believe very strongly in our faith. So, again, Mr. President, this is not about protecting children, because Senator Patton brought up, if you go into confession and you are behind the screen, how is the priest going to know? It's anonymous. Maybe you've never went to confession before. People say he recognizes your voice. How's he going to know if you never went? Or you went to a different priest that you, whatever. How are they going to know? What kind of obligation would they have then? And if they did report something, so let's just make a scenario that okay, this is the law of the land. Somebody is behind the screen, and he says, hey, I've abused children, and the priest goes and tells the cops, somebody who I don't know came into confession and confessed that they abused children. Well, how's that going to stand up in court? This isn't doing anything. If it does anything, Mr. President, we pass laws all the time and talk about the unintended consequences. Here's an unintended consequence for you, Mr. President. Somebody that is actually doing this, that is actually a child abuser, will not now go to confession. If he did go to confession, he would be told by that priest, make it right. You must turn yourself in. And maybe get some feeling there, and maybe get that little bit of guilt that we all have. And perhaps that person would then do the right thing and turn himself in. They're not going to do that. They're not going to go to confession. They're not going to get that acknowledgement by the priest on what to do to make himself right. So for that, Mr. President, again, this is a no on concurrence. Send it back to the House. Let them strip this off, and let's pass a bill that protects children. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further remarks, Senator Nobles.
Thank you, Mr. President. I stand with the hope that we concur with the changes to this legislation, simply because my uncle had an experience where because people in the church and in community were not honest about known abuse, it caused our family harm. And I want to be clear, in the case of my uncle, he caused harm in return because he was abused and also because he made poor choices. But before I was even 3 years old, my uncle was convicted for 2 murders. And one of them, many years later, one of those charges was overturned. I don't know all the legal court language, but I'm going to try my best here. But one of those sentences was overturned, and my uncle's sentence for execution later was made a stay of execution. Again, don't have all the language here. But what I know is when my uncle was charged, it was not made clear that he had been raped as a teenager by the clergyman who had groomed him. And it was also not brought forth that my uncle experienced abuse at home that many people also were aware of. And what later came to light was that not only were people knowledgeable that my uncle had been raped and abused by members of the church, but people were aware that those same people who were my uncle's victims, and again, what he did was horrendous, should have never happened. I'm not justifying his behavior, but I do know that that information made a difference in his case because many other young boys had been groomed and raped and sexually exploited by those victims. And so my vote today is in hopes that the secrets that exist in religion, that exist in churches, that are causing harm to young people and adults are brought to light. And I understand that for many of us, I identify as a Christian, I love the Lord, but also I value truth and I value consequence. And while no one's family member ever deserves to be harmed, and my uncle is being held accountable for his crimes, I do want to make sure that we are not allowing more people to be hurt so that they're not hurting more people. Because while his behavior and choices were extreme, and for many of those families, can be seen as unforgivable, there are folks who also demonstrate their harm in community by sexually assaulting other people or just by living with that trauma and never being the same. So I want things that have been kept in secret to come to light. I don't want another community to experience someone being raped and them retaliating or making poor choices, but also being very knowledgeable that many other young people are being harmed, abused by these same individuals. And so my vote today is for young people, is for adults. Again, it's not a justification for my uncle because he gets the consequences for his behavior, but it's also to hold the adults in our lives, and the adults in children's lives, and the adults in our religious spaces accountable for reporting, accountable for their behavior, and just for speaking up for victims in our community. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further remarks, Senator Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rising in opposition to the motion and coming at it from a perspective, I consider myself probably the least religious person on this side of the aisle, perhaps in the chamber. And that's where I take special pause and special care whenever we're addressing people's religious freedoms. This is a question of outcomes versus principles. We all want the same outcome in this body, but are we willing to sacrifice a principle, a constitutionally guaranteed right to worship as you see fit, not by somebody else's rules, not by rules that are made by a legislative body, but as your religion sees fit? I'm not going to compromise that principle to get to an outcome that I agree with. I'd like to also comment on an analogy that Senator Warnick made, the attorney-client privilege. And maybe it's a clumsy comparison, but from someone who's not in that world, it feels to me like a clergyman taking confession from a penitent person is representing that person to God. Vote no.
There are no further remarks. The question before the Senate, Senator Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in opposition to the concur of Senate Bill 5280 for a number of reasons. One is that it's very important to understand that this is our goal as human beings to protect our children and to protect them from violence and from trauma, and to have those lasting memories and to have those experiences. For me, this is about the importance of our religion. It was in 1978 that American Indians finally were provided the freedom of religion. Prior to that, it was against the law for American Indians to practice our religion. For me, it is about what is a priest and what is an elder. And in our religion, an elder is someone who is defined by their age and defined by their wisdom, defined by their experiences, and the respect that we hold for our elders. And to have our state come into our religion again and say what an elder can and cannot do, what an elder must and has to do, is another intrusion upon our religion and our beliefs and our practices. A priest is educated, is ordained, has responsibilities, conducts sermons, but an elder is something else, is more of a lay person, does not have those education, does not have all the things out there. And to include an elder within this is another inclusion into our religious freedom. So I would ask for no on the concurrence.
If there are no further remarks, the question before the Senate is the motion that the Senate do concur in the House amendments to Senate Bill 5280. Remote members are reminded to please raise your hand to indicate your vote. As many are in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes appear to have it. Division's been called for. All those in favor, please stand and remain standing until your vote is counted. All those opposed, please stand and remain standing until your vote is counted. The noes have it. The Senate does not concur in the House amendments to Senate Bill 5280.